Hello, everybody. It's Friday. That means it's time for another topic of the week. So, first things first, normal preamble. Last week's topic on your New Year's resolutions. Lots of good responses to that one. Lots of people making some commitments. Some big, some small. Some people maybe they already failed them. Who knows? But go check those out. Lots of good advice in there. Maybe some resolutions you want to make your own. So, as usual, that video, there it is, linked right down below. But let's turn to this week's topic. And for this week's topic, we're going to get a little more controversial. No, don't worry. We're not talking about any complicated social issues or anything like that. We're going to get real controversial. And that is on the nature of fantasy. So, I have a podcast with separate from my YouTube channel where I talk about RPG elements. It's linked down in the description if you want to check it out. It's called Undesign. But I was talking with my podcast companion recently about the nature of fantasy. Now, in the Switch, and I've done videos on the nature of what is, the fantasy setting of Age of Sigmar and our fantasy and sci-fi and what designates the genres and where their history come from. And he advanced the point that there really is no genre, or whatever, of fantasy. That fantasy is really just a subgenre of science fiction that often has very particular trappings. That there's basically, we tend to think of them as being sort of on similar footing, but his argument was that fantasy is innately very limited. And as a storytelling medium, it tends to be restrictive and it's, in his mind, boring, although he admitted that's completely personal taste. Now, the tricky part here is what exactly defines fantasy? As I was trying to push back on this and thought about it, I realized that even defining what fantasy is as a genre is difficult. So let me see if I can explain that. When the changeover to Age of Sigmar happened, or when a lot of people look at other unusual fantasy settings, I see them react with this pshaw. That's not real fantasy. And sort of have this, as I discussed in my video on the nature of fantasy, this sort of gut response that if it isn't in the template of Tolkien, if it doesn't have elves and dwarves and orcs and hobbits and that kind of thing, and it's not set in some sort of weird pseudo-European 14th century parallel to Earth, then it's not fantasy. And that tends to be the way that fantasy gets trotted out, right? If you think of, say, most conceptions of D&D, where this template was further reinforced, and in a lot of common fantasy stories, they're stories that are all it's the gods and they made races and they, yeah, we get it. It's just the same thing over and over again. And But clearly the fantasy genre, I would argue, can be bigger than that. So when people have that pushback, I always revolt immediately, because anybody who wants to draw that small of a box around fantasy is just really saying that it's a dead genre. Because if that's literally all the space we've created, then every story that can be told is already told of value. And I don't think that's the case at all, to be very clear. And I think there's lots of good writers who have pushed what the fantasy genre can be. Not only, and if you think about using parallels of different time periods and from Stone Age tech and having worlds that are almost completely magical. If you think of Numenera, which is, again, a fantasy science fiction setting. And that's just it. These two lines between these things bleed really easily. What makes fantasy fantasy? And that's ultimately the topic for this week. I want to know if you think fantasy is really its own genre, and if it is, what makes fantasy that genre for you? So maybe we have a little more esoteric topic this week. Because it can't be the easy answers. Let me explain why. You could say, well, it's magic. Well, no, that's not it. Okay? It can't be just the presence of magic. I've read plenty of good, gritty fantasy that has no magical elements in it whatsoever. So I don't think magic is a necessary part of the world. I think it's an often used part of the world, and that's fine. But it's not. It can't be a barrier. you say, well, it could be the moral, fantasy tends to have a stronger moral paradigm of good versus evil, whereas science fiction is often more gray. By the way, the presence of these two things is what makes people call Star Wars a fantasy story, not a sci-fi story, because it has this moral paradigm element, and it has space magic, also known as the Force, but it's just space magic and space wizards. Ninja space wizards, but still space wizards. But I don't think that's fair either, because when I look at worlds like Eberron, which is a genre bender itself, clearly in some method, having like some elements of pseudo steampunkish stuff, or there are people with guns, and like so it can't be the presence of guns and things like that. You know, that world clearly has a very gray morality. Or you look at like classic sword and sorcery. If you look at the world of Conan and stuff like that, I wouldn't exactly say that there's a real good against that evil. It's more like there's really, really evil, and then some people who are just like kind of not as bad. Namely Conan and the rest of the people who are our protagonists. So, but they're certainly not paradigms of good. So I thought it would be an interesting topic to put out there and discuss of how do you define what is fantasy? Do you think fantasy actually stands alone as a genre? Or is it simply, can all fantasy be folded up into sci-fi? Because, you know, sci-fi can have technology that's inexplainable and is certainly the equivalent of magic, or elements in the universe, or psychic powers, or any of these other things, which we might as well call magic, but it's just a different name, right? So the capability to have things unexplained is certainly also, again, not a good border between the two. And when I look at stories like, when I go back to my childhood and look at stories like Thundar the Barbarian and He-Man and stuff like that, you had people running around with swords and using magic and powers, and then you had laser guns and tanks. You know, and I would argue that that's clearly, like, it's science fiction that has fantastical elements to it. So, that's the question. There you go. That's this week's topic. I thought we'd get a little more esoteric this week, a little broader discussion. As always, I look forward to your responses. You can drop them down in the comments. Put what makes fantasy for you. Is it its own genre? Are you one of those people who limits fantasy to only the sort of like Tolkien template? And if so, why do you think, why is that? Why do other types of fantasy that bleed and have bug people or are set in the Stone Age or whatever not work for you? Okay? So, that's what I look forward to. As always, video responses will be linked down below, so you can always come back to this video and find those. But as always, we'll see you next time.